All right, everybody, we are going to go over Chapter 18, the first chapter for our final unit on the urinary system and fluid balance. So our urinary system is the major excretory system of the body. We have some other organs and other systems, just like our digestive system, that help us to eliminate waste. But our kidneys and the urinary system are the primary way that we do this. And so without our kidneys, at least one kidney anyway, our body cannot compensate for this function. So the urinary system is relatively simple in terms of its components. We have two kidneys. These sit at the kind of posterior part of the abdominal cavity, kind of just below the diaphragm. The adrenal glands sit right on top of our kidneys, even though they're not part of our urinary system. And then we have our ureters that are going to carry urine from the kidney down to our urinary bladder. And then from the urinary bladder, we have our urethra to carry urine to the external environment. So one major difference in the male and female urinary system is the length of the urethra. In the female urinary system, the urethra is much shorter and closer to the external environment, which primarily where that comes into play is that females are much more prone to UTIs or infections because there's just less distance for bacteria, viruses, whatever, to travel. So as always, we need to know the primary functions for our body systems. So number one here is excretion. Number two, we regulate blood volume and pressure with our urinary system. So our kidneys have the ability to kind of control how much water we are getting rid of or retaining, which largely affects blood volume and pressure. We'll talk about that mechanism a bit more. Our urinary system also regulates blood solutes. So a solute is something that is dissolved in a solvent, in this case, in the liquid portion of our blood, the plasma. This is going to include glucose, other electrolytes like sodium, calcium, potassium, all of that in terms of how much we get rid of, how much we retain is determined by our kidneys. Regulation of extracellular fluid, pH, so the fluid that lies outside of our body cells. Regulation of red blood cell synthesis, so our kidneys help us to control when we need to make more red blood cells. And it also has a role in the regulation of vitamin D synthesis, so a very important vitamin in the body. So there's two kidneys right and left, two ureters right and left, and that meets at one bladder and, of course, one urethra to the external environment. So here's just another diagram of our urinary system. Everything in the urinary system is bolded there. We just added the liver and spleen, the adrenal glands, and some of our major vessels to give you just a little bit more context. You can see our kidneys lie just at the end of the rib cage, and they're in the posterior part of our abdominal cavity. So they're considered retroperitoneal, so they sit behind the peritoneum, which is that membrane that covers a majority of our abdominal cavity. They're bean-shaped. That's why I'm sure you've heard of having kidney beans before. And they're relatively small, just about the size of a bar of soap or the size of your fist. And they're between that final thoracic, number 12, the end of our false ribs there, and the third lumbar vertebrae. So the actual structure of the kidney, each kidney has a renal capsule, and this is just kind of a connective tissue sac around each kidney, which is mostly there just for protection. We have the hilum. So if you remember back from the digestive system chapter, the hilum of the liver is where the arteries, veins, and nerves entered. Same thing for our kidneys. The hilum is where the renal artery, renal veins, the nerves, and the ureter are going to enter. A couple other of the kidney structures that you should be aware of and know kind of the definition for is the renal sinus, which is where the renal pelvis and some of the blood vessels are. And we'll look at a diagram of this and go over this with the visual as well. Our renal cortex is the outer portion. Our renal medulla is the inner portion. So think middle medulla for that inner portion. The renal pyramid is kind of a cone or triangle shaped structure within that medulla. And so that actually starts in the medulla or inner portion, and it's going to project out into that outer portion or cortex. We have renal papillae, which are the tips of these renal pyramids, and they help to drain urine into the calyces. And then our renal pelvis is where multiple calyces join together, and eventually that will continue to narrow to form the ureter. So the one on the left, obviously here is a digital picture, and this is what it looks like if we were to look at a cadaver. So this hilum or indentation area, you see all the vessels and nerves entering. And then if I zoom in here, we have our renal capsule. Remember that covers the outer portion of the kidney. The cortex itself is the outer portion of the kidney. And when we take this cross section, you have the medulla, which is going to be our inner section. And so we have these renal papilla and pyramids that are going to be in each section here. So each section of the medulla has this renal papilla and renal pyramid. And so what happens is we begin to form urine on this outer portion. The renal pyramid begins to funnel that urine to the renal papilla. Our renal papillae come and join as the calyces and eventually the renal pelvis and then into the ureter. So we go from pyramid to papilla to calyx to pelvis to ureter. So that's something that I'll put on your outline for sure, is understanding the kind of direction of flow of urine. So the kidney is our most important unit for our urinary system, but within the kidney, we have our nephron, is what we consider the functional unit. So each individual kidney has over 1 million nephrons. Approximately 15% of those nephrons are juxtamedullary, and so I'll go over what that is in just a second. So our nephron includes the renal corpuscle, the proximal convoluted tubule, the loop of Henle, our distal convoluted tubule, and a collecting duct. So all of these structures together make up the nephron. Okay, there we go. So this is where our juxtamedullary nephron comes into place. It has this long loop of Henle, it's called, that is going to extend out here from our cortex into the medulla. And so these are our nephrons that are most responsible for our water conservation and actual concentration of urine. So these juxtamedullary nephrons, these are our most important ones, is how you can kind of think of it. So just to orient you guys here, this is the cortex, this lighter pink. So a lot of our nephron structure is out in the cortex. And then we have this loop of Henle and our distal convoluted tubule that ends and extends into our renal pyramid within the medulla. And we're going to go over how this functions. I don't want to get into it too much. It's not going to make much sense yet. Okay, our renal corpuscle. So this is the filter portion of the nephron. So we're going to kind of break this nephron down a little bit. So the filtration portion of the nephron is our renal corpuscle. So just to orient you guys, we're right here is this renal corpuscle. So if we were to open up this renal corpuscle, this is what it would look like. We have this capillary network on the inside surrounded by a capsule. So the glomerulus is our network of capillaries, glomerulus. And so they kind of twist around each other. They almost look like a ball of yarn that's been tidied up or cleaned up. So that glomerulus or that capillary network is surrounded by Bowman's capsule, sorry. And so this Bowman's capsule is going to catch some of the fluid that's being pushed out of our glomerulus. So this is going to end up opening into our proximal convoluted tubule. So our capsule, our Bowman's capsule, is capturing some of the fluid being pushed out under the high pressure in our capillary network of the glomerulus. And so then the Bowman's capsule will collect that fluid and filter it into the proximal convoluted tubule. Our Bowman's capsule contains these structures known as podocytes. And so these are specialized cells that are around our glomerular capillaries that help to kind of catch or funnel that fluid. So this structure in our renal corpuscle makes up what's known as our filtration membrane. So that is the capillary endothelium, the wall of our capillary of the glomerulus, the basement membrane of our capillary, and then the podocytes of the Bowman capsule. So that's where our filtration membrane is. So what we term filtrate is the fluid that filters out of our glomerular capillaries, and it's what is going to enter inside of the Bowman's capsule. So our renal corpuscle, kind of its job is to make filtrate. So the glomerulus is under high pressure, fluid is forced out of the glomerular capillaries and collected by Bowman's capsule, and that's what we call our filtrate. This slide goes into a little more detail than we need to be concerned with. What you guys should know is that we have blood entering our renal corpuscle via our afferent arteriole. So now we have our capillary network here. That's the glomerulus. It's under high pressure here. So a lot of fluid is being forced out and captured by Bowman's capsule.